So many candidates campaigning in Wisconsin's presidential primary, we decided it might be best to talk with them in groups rather than freight train fashion individually. And getting candidates to sit down together during a campaign is always a rather delicate matter, and the fairest way that we knew to go about it, to decide who sits with whom and at what hour, was simply to draw lots, which we did. Actually, representatives of the candidates drew pieces of paper from a Wisconsin cheese box to form the groupings, and then their time slot was decided by the toss of a coin. And of the 8 candidates who have actually campaigned here, 2 declined, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm and former Senator Eugene McCarthy, on the understandable basis that they would not be in the state today. But 6 others are joining us today. In our other hour, Senators Hubert Humphrey and Henry Jackson and Governor George Wallace. And in this hour, and with us now, Senators George McGovern and Edmund Muskie and Mayor John Lindsay of New York. Welcome, all of you. And let me say on your behalf that this is intended to be a discussion rather than a more formal debate.
Frank, I thought you brought us in early because we were younger.
We had a group here yesterday that was a little bit younger than this panel we put together this morning.
You certainly did.
And they did very well. As you know, there is a drive now. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are pushing across the DMZ and deeper into South Vietnamese territory. And aside from your overall general views on the war, I wonder what you think President Nixon should do to handle this immediate threat to South Vietnam. And may I begin with you, Senator McGovern?
Well, I think what it indicates, Mr. McGee, is that the Vietnamization policy of President Nixon is not the answer. That's the first thing that's clear. That policy depended on reducing American forces to a level of about 100,000 men, on the theory that the South Vietnamese army could contain any threat mounted by the other side. I've never thought that would work. I think the only alternative that we have is to set a date for the orderly disengagement of our forces, not this slow, agonizing withdrawal combined with very heavy bombing of North Vietnam, because the bombing leaves the other side really no alternative except to respond in the only way they can. They haven't got any bombers, so they're going to hit back on the ground. And this thing could go on forever. We hit them with bombers, they hit us on the ground. So what we ought to do, it seems to me, is the same thing I've advocated and others have advocated: announce a date for the orderly disengagement of our forces, for breaking any further relationship with General Tu. Let him worry about his own political future. I think when we do that, we can work out arrangements for a safe disengagement, and I have the feeling that once we're out of there, the other side will come to terms with the new regime.
Senator Muskie, how do you think the president should handle the threat?
Well, first of all, I'd like to make an observation. One, that in some 10 days now, the president has broken off negotiations in Paris, and the military activity has increased. This is the exact reversal of the direction that I would have urged upon him, and I think the exact reversal of the direction the American people want. Now, I can't make his tactical decision. I can only suggest what we ought not to do. We ought not to use this period and this development as a reason to re-escalate American involvement or participation in the war. I think our objective must be, as Senator McGovern has said, to set a date for orderly withdrawal and do our best at the peace table in Paris to take diplomatic initiatives that would bring an end to the war as well as an end to our involvement. Developments there are going the reverse of what they ought to be, and I think this poses the great dilemma that we've all feared Vietnamization would produce, and Senator McGovern has stated it, that at some point in our withdrawal, when our presence was small enough not to constitute a deterrent, we might well have expected, as we now have, a major offensive by the other side.
Mayor Lindsay, how do you think the president
Well, I think the president ought to stop supporting the Thieu government. I never thought he should have supported it, or this country should have done it. It's been wrong since Diem and straight through to Thieu. Stop the bombing and withdraw the troops immediately. Just get out of there. I think that's the only way you're going to possibly survive this mess. It's predictable that when you reduce to a level of 100,000 troops or less, that you could risk the annihilation of these American troops. And the president's just repeating what the errors were in Cambodia in 1970 and Laos in 1971.
And if South Vietnam is overrun, what then, Senator McGovern?
Well, Mr. McGee, that may happen even if we stay there another 5 or 10 years. If we couldn't save the two regime with 500,000 Americans there, who supposes we can do it with 100,000? I don't think the American people are prepared to go back in there with another 500,000 men or 1,000,000 or whatever it might take to keep that corrupt dictator in power in Saigon. That was the lesson we learned in the 1960s, that American troops can't compensate for a crooked government in South Vietnam. Even bombing North Vietnam doesn't make that government in South Vietnam any more popular with its own people. So sooner or later, we're just going to have to recognize that the political future of the Saigon regime is something the people of that area will have to resolve. We can't do it for them.
Let me turn to another subject now. As you know, many professionals in your own party, in the Democratic Party, are beginning to believe that the primaries are really not going to help the party select the candidate, and that you'll go to the convention with no clear front runner, to use that cliche, and that then a movement, you may have a deadlock convention, and then a movement might develop to nominate some dark horse, someone we've not heard of at all, or perhaps Senator Edward Kennedy. Could you come on that, Senator Muskie?
Oh, I think it's much too early to project anything of that kind. We're in the fourth primary. There are 23. It's a 23-inning ball game, and it isn't going to be won in one inning. And the runs would accumulate for the various candidates as we go along, and we'll see at the convention. Senator Kennedy has indicated very clearly, and I think very strongly, his reluctance or his refusal to be a candidate, here or at the convention. The primaries, how do you predict what they'll produce? There have been surprises already, some. There'll be others. The field, I think, will narrow as we go along, or at least the prospects are good that it will. And if it does, if that happens, you're going to get a clearer-cut contest among fewer candidates. We'll see what happens. I think it's too early to predict anything like that.
Mayor Lindsay?
Well, the alternatives that are suggested are a one-shot countrywide primary of some kind. And I'm not ready to come down on that side because I think that's too instant. That might put a premium on pure television, or it might put a premium on the very rich. And I think that the primary testing process is not bad. I think that the real problem with it is the cost of it. I think if you could force a reduction in the cost by really tough laws, that would tend automatically to shrink it down. And but the primary process, it means you're going through a transition period in the country anywhere where you're decentralizing this whole process. So the way it's done now is an appropriate testing method. All candidates have liabilities of some kind. That's the problem of not putting a candidate through the primary process, and those are tested in the course of this contest.
I want to get your views on this in just a moment, Senator McGovern. We have to break away now. We'll be back after this message. We're talking with Senators McGovern and Muskie and Mayor John Lindsay, and the question before us, and it's actually before you, Senator McGovern, do you think that you're likely to go into the convention deadlocked and have to come out with a compromise candidate?
Well, I don't really expect that. I think the testing process before the convention will probably narrow the race down to the point where we'll have a fairly good indication of who the nominee is likely to be. I remember back in 1960, considering all the stresses and strains of this contest for the nomination, Adlai Stevenson said he thought the nominee would be the last survivor. And certainly the physical strain and the sheer stress of this operation gives some point to that. But I feel, as John Lindsay does, that this system, with all of its faults, is a pretty good one. It really gives the voters a chance to see the candidates close in, and I think it's a great education for the candidate. Never again can I feel quite the same about a factory or a shop as I do now after having walked through hundreds of them and have come to see and appreciate the conditions under which many of our fellow Americans work. I think this has been a great experience.
Picking up Senator McGovern's line that it's been an education, Senator Muskie, before the primaries started, all the polls showed that you were well ahead of the rest of the Democratic contenders. You won in New Hampshire. You've had some other successes other places and reverses other places. And now most polls show you either second or third. If you don't come out, say, in the top 2 here in Wisconsin, what will your plans be?
Well, I really don't see why, with the most victories up to this point, that question should be put to me first.
Would you like me to put it to someone else first?
But I'd be happy to answer. No, as I said earlier, Frank, this is a 23-inning ball game, really 50 if you count the non-primary states, and you don't get all your runs in 1 inning. And, this is home territory, in a sense, for Senator McGovern. It certainly is for Senator Humphrey, as New Hampshire was for me. Those are natural advantages. I will have natural advantages in some other states. George may, John may. And so the natural advantages will give, will play back and forth. But what you have your eye on is that 51% of the delegates that you need in the convention. That's where my eye has been all the time. The polls, whether they're favorable or unfavorable, aren't going to settle this. I like the favorable polls. I don't like the unfavorable ones. But the delegates are what counts. Now, and I'm ahead in the delegate count at this point. Hope to continue to stay there. But who knows what's going to happen? You just fight this thing from beginning to end until you come through. As George says, the survivor maybe is the one who can stand the gap until that point.
On these polls, a Lewis Harris poll released, and I'm sure you've seen it, Mayor Lindsay, said that I believe 48% of the electorate feel that you, quote, became a Democrat less out of conviction and more to get a chance to run for the president.
Well, I think my immediate answer to that would be that if you sat in my chair for 6 years as mayor of New York City, you'd understand why I've made the decisions I have. That's a very tough government, a tough job, and a very tough but great city. And I found that it is impossible to do for people what has to be done through the controlling leadership of the Republican Party. It's one of the great political disappointments of my life, but it's true. And I think the only hope of change is through the Democratic Party in this nation.
Well, we had earlier on our program a report of what we called a kind of a revolt by farmers here in Wisconsin on property taxes. Do you find that the farmers across the country are really sympathetic toward the kind of problem that you're concerned with or have been concerned with, the urban problem, city problem?
Well, I think farmers are listening. I spent a whole night on a family dairy farm in Wisconsin here, and we came out of that with the conclusion that there are a lot of powerless people. The family farmer is a powerless man. He hasn't gained an inch in his net income in 10 years. And if that farm is abandoned, that hurts the cities. That hurts the consumers. The consumer in the city has a stake in a competitive farm system, and vice versa. And I think perhaps it may take a big city man to educate consumers and the stake that they have in a competitive system, particularly a family farm. Property tax is something we all live with. I've been battling this fight for a long time as one who was in local government who's been forced to pick up the tab for the absence of clear federal action on local people and the farmer and on the city man. Has been dumped all of the social ills of this country, and it's been accumulating. And small wonder the property tax has escalated. And that's why I think this Wisconsin primary is so important, among other things. I found that Wisconsin people have somehow persuaded candidates to be more substantive in this contest here than I think I've ever heard in any battleground or political battleground. One of the battles has been, why has the property tax gone up so high? This has been an education, I think, for a lot of people.
Sir, it was earlier, and it was at my insistence, we discussed the war. But in your campaign, as you've gone along, it seems that you've turned less and less from a discussion of the war to other issues. Now, what brought this about?
Well, Frank, I've discussed both, and I've tried to show, for example, that one of the reasons taxes are high is because we've spent $150 billion on the war in Southeast Asia. One of the reasons we have inflation is because you always have inflation when you have a war going on, so that you can't separate the domestic problems that we have at home from this cancerous and mistaken war that we're waging abroad. But I do think the question that has come into focus here in Wisconsin and in other parts of the country is the question of tax justice. It isn't that people object to paying taxes. What they object to is the farmer maybe earning $7,000 or $8,000 a year, and paying 10% of that into property taxes and another 10 or 15% into income taxes. And then he reads in the press where some big corporation that earns several $100 million pays little or nothing. Now, this comes right back onto those of us in public life to do something about that. If we're to avoid a tax revolt in this country, we better find some way to reconstruct this tax program so that people pay on a just and fair basis. I think that's what the tax issue is all about.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for being with us this morning. We realize it's an early hour and it's at some sacrifice to your time and energy to be with us. We appreciate it. Senator McGovern, Senator Muskie, Mayor John Lindsay.
Be sure to vote before you leave.
That would be something. We'll be back after this message.